Good evening, everyone. My name is Stephanie Parrish. I'm the Associate Director of Education here at the Art Museum. And I have the great pleasure of helping to organize events like this series. When the museum announced its Tuileries exhibition last year, we knew immediately that we wanted to use this opportunity as a way to talk about Portland's own park system and our green spaces. And it was not a very far leap to make the call over to the University of Oregon and start talking to faculty and staff there about how we might partner, what we might do to help surface some of the histories, the present, the future of our parks. And with the help of Randy Gragg, we developed this conversation series, which is a 4-part series taking place throughout the month of July. How many of you were here for Beginnings last week? So, fair number of you. That's great. Welcome back. Tonight, we are very much in the present. We are talking with the current Parks Director, Mike Abbate, and a former Parks Director, Zari Santner. And next week, you'll be interested, we're talking about Portland's next parks. And that will be sort of a rapid-fire series of Pecha Kuchka-style conversations that will tempt us with what might be possible next. I want to give you a little bit of warning that tonight we are sharing this space with a film, so we're going to be needing to exit the room by about 7:30. So without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Randy. But before I do, let me just very quickly introduce Randy. He is a writer, editor, and organizer who has worked in the Northwest for the past 28 years. He's currently the director of the University of Oregon's John Yon Center and editor-at-large at Portland Monthly Magazine. He's president of the Halpern Landscape Conservancy and on the board of Pioneer Courthouse Square. And he wrote previously for The Oregonian on culture and urban issues. He was a Loeb Fellow at Harvard University's Graduate School of Design, and he also served as a National Arts Journalism Fellow at Columbia. So please join me in welcoming Randy Gragg.
Thanks, Stephanie. So welcome to Force of Nature, Portland's Parks Past, Present, and Future. Last week, as Stephanie said, we got a little dose of history with a trio of historians, and we discussed the dawn of Portland Park System and the important influences and philosophy of Frederick Law Olmsted and John Charles Olmsted and the engineer Emmanuel Miche. And our conversation covered everything from the constituent components of the picturesque to the general agreement that we need to cut down some trees to reacquaint ourselves with the awesome natural setting that we live in. Next week, as Stephanie suggested, we're going to meet 6 of Portland's most accomplished landscape designers, and they're going to share with us some ideas for parks that maybe we haven't even thought about yet. So please don't miss that. And then on the 31st, we're going to bring the lens back and look at the region kind of through the conceit of a park as a managed landscape for beauty. And we're going to have a great group of folks for that, so don't miss that on the 31st. So on to tonight. I first want to introduce our guests. Zari Santner's career in shaping the landscape spans 35 years, from working in the private sector to capping it with 8 years as Portland's director of Portland Parks and Recreation. She oversaw some of the city's largest and, when they were completed, most popular parks, including the Veracats Esplanade and Jameson Square, and also the Southwest Community Center. Under her leadership as the division manager, the Parks Bureau developed its second comprehensive parks master plan in 100 years, number 2 after Olmsted, known as Parks Vision 2020 Plan. She graduated from Harvard Graduate School of Design and has a bachelor's in horticulture from Tehran University, from her homeland. And on a personal note, I just want to say Zari's enthusiasm and just general articulatedness, to coin a word, about her projects in the early 90s were one of the big inspirations for me to really begin writing more about architecture than art. So I owe her a lot. having succeeded Zari only 3 years ago in the middle of a recession, a lot of Mike Abbate's legacy is still ahead of him. But his 3-decade career so far suggests a huge amount of promise as our parks director. As a landscape designer, he contributed to, among other parks, Portland's Tanner Springs Park and Hood River's Waterfront Park. As urban design and planning director with the city of Gresham, he developed basically their design review system from scratch, the Design Excellence Initiative and the Design Commission. And in his 7 years with the Forest Service, he helped develop major recreation and interpretive facilities throughout the Pacific Northwest, including at Multnomah Falls, Mount St. Helens, Columbia River Gorge, and Mount Hood. And he's a Cal Poly Pomona graduate in landscape architecture, and he's also an author, Gardening Eden, How Creation Care Will Change Your Faith, Your Life, and Our World, published by Random House. Now, real quick, I want to tell you a little bit about my new gig. I have basically keys to 2 of the most beautiful properties in Oregon, the 1937 Watzik House and a 75-acre preserve in the Columbia Gorge. That was, both of which were designed by John Yan, and this comprises the John Yan Center. And I hope you'll come visit and visit our website. And so that's my little commercial for the center. We're doing tours in August at both the house, August and September at both the house and the Shire. So look out for those. Now on to the real job of tonight. We wanted to take a look at, in a sense, the legacies in the making. I mean, Zari, over 20 years with Portland Parks, created a lot of parks that we're still sort of seeing how they are manifesting, socially, as landscapes. And obviously, with Mike having come on now, executing the next few years, we will see, the future of the parks unfold, particularly as we're going to see probably a fairly precipitous population increase in Portland, and certainly we are more and more becoming the focus of certainly the New York Times, if nothing else, and IFC. But so we thought it was to take an opportunity to really look at what's going on, and so I wanted to begin with a sort of State of the Union. What do you think are the sort of key issues that are really setting the stage for parks at this time?
Okay. And I'm starting first.
Yes.
Correct. Good evening. Thank you, Randy, for inviting me and pulling me out of retirement. And I rather
on a
have
sunny
not.
afternoon.
Right. But so I may be a little bit rusty here. So please pardon me if I hem and haw a little bit here. I've been out of the picture 3 years, and believe me, it's a long time. Portland, the way Portland is right now, this vibrant city that we have today, owes a lot to its park system, in my view, and I'm sure you share that. And the reason we have such a tremendous park system is because of bold actions that were taken by people who had great foresight. When the city was just barely a few hundred acres, the founders of the city set aside a string of parks that became South Park blocks. And later, at the turn of the 20th century, it took really bold actions to promote and be activists and finally convince the city to preserve over 2,000 acres of forested land that now is the biggest urban forest in the nation, which is Forest Park. So these were all bold actions that were taken, and we are the beneficiary. We, as residents of Portland now, are the beneficiary of many, many years of a legacy of rich investment in city's park system, and the pride people took in creating their park system. And over the past 100 years, this system has grown based on Olmsted plan that was discussed last year. But it took much longer than was supposed to, primarily because although the will was there, but the funding was not available, was inadequate. And there were peaks and valleys. We have right now one of the best park systems in the country. It's gold medal winner. And it is great because of its array of parks, variety, its quality, the committed staff that spend a lot of time in taking care of them. But making sure that we can preserve that, but also build on it for our future generations really needs bold actions. Because we could have achieved a lot of our divisions that were developed by Olmsted. We had a lot of missed opportunities. I don't know what was discussed last week, but Olmsted vision was very comprehensive, and because it took us so much time, we didn't have money, the city didn't have money, we lost opportunities. Now, as you mentioned, we have 2020 plan. We've made a lot of progress, but I have to tell you, and Mike probably would cover this, there are 20% of Portlanders that do not live within half a mile or a 50-minute walk of the park system. And when we started the 2020 vision plan, that was about 20, around, I think it was 27% that did not live around, at that proximity. We only made progress like by 6%, and that's 13 years. At the rate that the city's investing in its park system, if we want to achieve the 2020 plan, it's going to take us another 45 to 50 years. So I believe it's our responsibility to also take bold actions. And in my view, that bold action is to create dedicated source of funding for Portland parks. This instability of funding, the fluctuation, constant fluctuation, doesn't really allow the system to grow and in a reasonable manner. And generations will grow, will be born, raised, grown, leave without having the advantage of the services that parks provide. And the library system has shown us how it can be done. And I want to take this opportunity and call upon you, and I am willing to roll up my sleeves to do that, to really start initiating, developing a plan for dedicated funding for park system. I think that's the challenge. Lack of adequate funding is a challenge, and addressing that is the most important thing.
Okay. Mike? Can move forward here to some images that you wanted to bring.
Well, I think I can't agree with Zari more. I obviously know a lot more about the parks budget now than I did 3 years ago. And as she mentioned, I think there's really two challenges, but I really do believe there are opportunities. Portlanders have always believed that access to parks and recreation was kind of a key part of our DNA. It's going back to John Couch in 1865, donating the 5 blocks that became the North Park blocks. As a matter of fact, between 1865, if I said 1865 and 1875, the North Park blocks, the South Park blocks, Chapman and Lounsdale squares, and what we now know as Washington Park all came into the system at the very time when the city was forming itself. So early on, we believed that having access to those parks and open spaces was critical. And as Zari mentioned, 20% of Portlanders don't have access. And just recently, we announced Commissioner Amanda Fritz is the Parks Commissioner. A major investment of system development charge funds in East County. This is one of the key parks. This is Gateway Park and Plaza in the Gateway District at about 107th. And this will become what Pioneer Courthouse Square is to downtown. This will become the gathering spot. the place for events, community events, a fountain, bands, concerts. This will become for East Portland their sort of a place of gathering. So that's one sort of challenge that, that I think we're up to. And as Zari mentioned, with this gap of 20% of Portlanders not having access to parks, during the recession, the city and Portland Parks Bureau under Zari's leadership did something very smart. They bought a bunch of land at low cost when property values went down. And what that did was set the stage for us as we now move ahead, because we've got pieces of property where we can now develop parks. And as the city grows and those revenues come in through this one mechanism, system development charges, which are fees when new buildings are built, we'll be able to develop some of those parks. But the second big challenge, I think, facing parks is taking care of what we have. I talked about 1865 when we get our first donations of parks property. Now, watch this sequence of slides. This is how Portland has grown. So before we go to the next one, the shaded areas in gray are the city limits. The red are the parks that were added during that decade. So we're gonna grab from 1865 to 1900 and start there. And this is the city limits in 1900. You can see it doesn't even reach out as far as Mount Tabor. And then the 1900 to 1909, you start picking up Mount Tabor and some eastern parks, a couple of parks in Southwest, Maclay. Keep going through the 1910s, and you can see that as every time the city grew, we purchased some property. The 1930s, the 1940s. The 1940s are critical because you see that big piece, which is maybe our absolute most dramatic and significant park, and that's Forest Park at 5,000 acres. The 50s, the 60s, and the 70s. And what you'll see there is a whole bunch of property acquired in the 80s and 90s when the mid-Multnomah County was annexed by the city. What happened, though, particularly east of 205, is when the city of Portland acquired those properties from the county, they didn't come with a park infrastructure like the rest of the city had developed over the previous 100 years. And so now, that's where we're trying to catch up. That's where we've been buying property, and that's where we've been developing property over time. Now, here's what's really key. Now a new column, funding. You'll see that those acquisitions and those developments of parks never happened through what we call the general budgeting process or the general fund. That was always how you maintain what you have. But the development of parks and the acquisition of property was done by levies and bonds. And you can see that list of successful bond measures that have passed. On average, it's about 9.5 years. Every 9.5 years, Portlanders have stood up and said, hey, we're going to make an investment in the future. And as Zari said, in 2011, Portland won the gold medal as the best park system in the United States. We have all of these preceding generations to thank for bringing us, for creating that system. But a good example of taking care of what you have is Pioneer Courthouse Square. It just celebrated a few weeks ago its 30th birthday. In 30 years, did you know that about the population of the United States of America, over 300 million people have visited Pioneer Courthouse Square. Can you imagine 300 million people in your house, in your living room? It is Portland's living room after all. Can you imagine how much wear and tear it would have? Well, Pioneer Courthouse Square is a great example. Next time you are in the square, just kind of take a look around. Look a little bit more closely. Built 30 years ago, you know all the underground space where the restrooms and the TriMet and KGW, Travel Portland are. There's a roof above them, and in that roof, buried underneath the bricks, is a waterproof membrane that was designed to keep the water out of the interior space, like most of us in our roofs at home. And it was built with a waterproof membrane with a 20-year lifespan, and that was pretty good back in those days. So it's 30 years old. Guess what happened about 10 years ago? It started leaking. And so this is a prime example of not properties that haven't been maintained, but just the wear and tear on a property that happens over time. And some others, any folks from Northwest know about the playground in Cooch that we had to close a couple months ago because I got a structural engineer report saying it's not safe, and our staff had looked at it and said, we got to protect kids. We've got mechanical systems in pools that are from the 1920s and 1930s. And all of this is to say that, repairing and replacing things, it's not the glittery, the shiny, the new things, but it's what good stewards do. And I think that's one of both the challenge and opportunity is we want to make sure that when we pass this on to the next generation, it's in better shape than it is. And so Commissioner Fritz, next week, as a matter of fact, the City Council is going to be discussing whether or not to put on the ballot in November a bond measure, what we're calling a parks replacement bond. Our last bond for capital improvements was passed in 1995, and it's about to expire. It's a 20-year bond. It'll expire in 2015. If we let it expire, all of us, our average taxes will drop by $13 a year. If we renew it, it'll generate $68 million that would renovate Pioneer Courthouse Square, that would fix pools across the city, playgrounds across the city, restrooms across the city. It would make accessibility improvements throughout the entire city. So this is a two-pronged approach, two strategies. How do you get parks to those who don't have them? And then for those who do, how do you make sure that you're taking good care of them and you're making capital investments?
I want to circle back to both of those topics in a little bit, but the first thing I wanted to do before that is fill in a little gap between last week and this week. And so I asked Zari and Mike to talk a little bit about other parks directors in the past whose work really set the stage. I mean, we kind of tend to think about Olmsted, and everybody gets very romantic about the Olmsted plan. But there's a whole lot of other history that happened, in between, and so I invited them to chat about that. And first up is Mike on that.
Well, I often say that I have the best job in the city. I really believe I do, and one of the reasons I do is I have this legacy. I'm standing literally on the shoulders of people like Zari and Charles Jordan and Emmanuel Miche, and a gentleman that I'd like to talk about, and that's Paul Kaiser. Paul Kaiser, look at that. He was the superintendent of parks from 1917 to 1949. And if you understand the commission style of government, which we have, that in itself is a miracle. And not only that, he wasn't just a bureaucrat that sat back and waited for things to happen and didn't ruffle any feathers. He did an amazing number of things. He grew the system. When he took over the system, we had 10 parks. By the time he left, we had 101. We had 136 acres of parks in 1917. When he retired, we had 5,000 acres. We now have 11,500. But can you imagine that sort of impact? He established the International Rose Test Garden in 1917. He created the position of a city forester. He created public golf in 1915 and established East Moreland Golf Course. Amazing man. In 21, he started what he called the Community House Program. That's what we now know as our community centers. This idea of places in the community that people could gather for activities and interaction. And maybe the biggest thing that he did was in 1937, he said, you know what? Parks aren't just about places. They're about people and programs. And if we can go to the next slide. And in 1937, he hired this woman, Dorothea Lynch. She was the director of recreation. A woman was hired as the director of recreation in 1937. That is an amazing thing. And not only that, Dorothea Lynch was an absolute revolutionary, known throughout the country She was a PhD, she was a doctor, and she understood the relationship between recreation and health. So she created community center programs. She brought in ideas of involving the arts and dance in recreation programs. She had our first community centers built, like at Peninsula Park and other places. She paid special attention to children, especially children with mental and physical disabilities, and understood that dance and music was a way of engaging kids in recreation, in addition to athletics, because athletics was popular then. But she broadened the mission of the Bureau to include art and dance. So I think Paul Kaiser, he also led us through both the Depression, when the need and the demand for parks was at an all-time high and the resources at all-time low, and through World War II, when both people and materials you couldn't get. And yet the needs, Dorothea Lynch went to the shipyards and created recreation programs for shipyard workers and their families. So I think those two made a just absolutely huge impact on the DNA of the Bureau that we find today.
Well, you know, Mike and I talked about past directors, Sans, Emmanuel Niche, and really the two that stand out in terms of making significant differences were Kaiser and Charles Jordan, who passed away a few months ago. Before I start talking about this, I want to add one thing to the previous comments that Mike made, and the state of some of our infrastructure. I just want to give you one concept. The value, the replacement value of all of the park's asset is $1 billion. If there was an earthquake, fire, whatever, and you have to replace it, at the minimum, you have to spend $1 billion. When I left, the discretionary fund, means general fund, that was given for major maintenance was $900,000 a year. And that was at the height of it. So you can imagine if you had a house that cost $10 million and you only spend $100 a year trying to fix things up, what would happen to that? I just wanted to give you that perspective. The enormity of this infrastructure. Going back to Charles. Many of you know Charles, probably have talked to him. He probably had given you a hug and a kiss and called you by name. This man was amazing. He could remember everybody's name. When I started with the city in '82, Charles was on the city council. And I was lucky just within a year, after having Mildred Schwab as a commissioner of parks, that Charles became our commissioner. And for 3 or 4 years, Charles was our commissioner. And I started working with him, but not that much because I was the lowly parks designer planner, so got very few opportunities to interact with him. But I always was in awe of him. He's extremely charismatic, tall. But then he went to Texas and became director of Austin Park System. And he came back, and he was a different man, really. He came back like a preacher or a Pied Piper that was, all he could talk about was the value and benefits of park system. And given his eloquence, his inspirational style of talking, and his ability to connect with whomever he talked to, he started reinvigorating the passion about parks in Portlanders. And most importantly, and this is very important, at the time he became our parks commissioner, we had gone through a series of massive budget cuts, lack of good leadership in our parks system, and employee morale was very, very low. he realized that he needed to create that passion in the public. And by talking about that, he really increased the pride of the employee about the work that they did. And they kept giving more. They gave more. And he always, had this thing, this saying with the employees, we're not about fun and game. We're about building community. We're about building character in our children. We're helping our children. He had this incredible attachment to kids. And he wanted to make sure that every single kid in this city had opportunity to prosper. And he knew that through our programming, through use of our park system, they could have that opportunity. And I think then he moved on to a national level, and that was his biggest significance, to make sure that people of color, particularly African American, recognize this free asset that belonged to them and were not really utilizing it as much as they should. And he was the Pied Piper for them, talking about getting them out to nature, the value of nature. A friend of mine a few evenings ago told me that she was at a conference and she had her name. She was a previous Parks employee. And she had her name and it had Portland Parks and Recreation. And she said, within seconds she got to this hall, people would just come and as soon as they saw that she was from Portland, Charles Jordan, we can't wait to listen to him. So nationally, he really reignited that passion for parks. And then he was a kind man. He was kind, generous, and treated parks folks as his family. So he had a significant impact in terms of raising the stature of park system within our city and the value of that, as well as nationally. So it's an iconic figure, in my view.
I wanted to circle back just quickly about Dorothea Lynch. She's really one of this group of kind of proto-feminists in Portland, one of them being Annabelle Crocker, who ran this museum for many years, Julia Hoffman, another one. I am suddenly blanking on the name of the director of the library who built the downtown library.
Jenny Cooper.
No,
Way
way
back.
back. Yeah.
Way back. I see.
It'll come to me in a minute, but
Ask Bill Hawkins.
who was the library director who built the central library?
You're not talking about the librarian Crocker?
The library? No. The Crocker was the museum director. Anyway, it'll come to me in a minute. But anyway, there's this interesting context of just very progressive women in powerful positions in this period of Portland history that really needs to be written. And it's kind of this fabulous sort of setting for the city. I'm curious, Zari, you worked with over at least 4 or 5 different commissioners of parks during your career. Who really stands out as the best one?
Wow, that's a loaded question. As I mentioned, I started with Mildred Schwab. She was a curmudgeon, and she took pride in demeaning staff when they made presentations. So unfortunately, I can't say anything good about her. Then was Charles, who was always, another thing about Charles was he was not a technical man. He was not an expert. But he could recognize it, and then he would let you soar. He would always come to me and say, "I'm giving you wings so you can soar." So that was the kind of person and leader he was. They each had their strength and shortcomings. So I can't really say who was the best leader. For their time, the time that they came, they did some fabulous stuff. You know, one of the things that Charles did when he was commissioner that I think was very significant was establishing the Interstate Firehouse Theater. Mm-hmm. At that time, there were no cultural facility that people of color or diverse immigrants could go and feel that this was their place and they can present their stuff. And so that was very important. And I think we have some missed opportunities on that I'm very sorry about, but that was very important. Then Mike Lindbergh. Mike Lindbergh, during his tenure, we had our first levy. It was small, Parks levy in like 50 years. We didn't have any money. And this was in mid-'80s. And he was the one that, when I went to his office and showed some sketches of East Bank Esplanade, he said, well, I think we can promote that. And he would walk with me. Honestly, we would go to various neighborhood association meetings or civic organization carrying these boards back in the old days. And he would talk about it, and he would let me explain things. And he was the first commissioner that saw the value of providing access to the river on the east side. And then after that, it was our current mayor, Charlie Hales. He was young, was very bold, politically foolish, but he was bold, and that served Parks well. Because within a year and a half after he was our commissioner and recognized, I mean, you saw those pictures, you should have seen the system, the condition, the deferred maintenance of the system back in the late 80s and early 90s. And he said, well, we need to do something about it. What can we do? And people said, well, we can go for a levy. How about 5 million, 10 million? He said, what? How much do we need to fix this? They said 100 million. He said, we're going for 100 million. And people had to calm them down. We did the polling. We're going for 100 million. And bureau staff were very, very worried. They said, well, this is the first major one in many, many years, so let's go halfway. How about that? And he finally agreed, okay, we go for a $58 million bond measure, which was the first major infusion of funding. So that had a significant impact. Because immediately after that, I think a year before that, Metro's first green spaces bond failed. And the way this Parks bond was run and organized really informed the other 1995 first successful Metro bond, which was passed, because then, you know, the whole city was ready. At least in Multnomah County, they were ready to go for that regional fund, which was very important. And after Charlie Hales was Jim Francisconi. Jim's passion really was about kids, about people, disadvantaged kids. So he was very instrumental in creating this Sun Schools program with the help of county and school district. You know, education was his passion. But I had to educate Jim, and he was a good learner. And we talked about, you know, funding. I talked about the fact that funding was always an issue. But the city at that time, the time that Jim was on board, was growing very fast. A lot of developments were happening. And we were worried that we could not secure land. And we told him, you know, all various municipalities around our city, they had system development charges, which means that if you are creating new development, that development has to pay a fee towards the infrastructure that they are going to be beneficiary of. Transportation had system development charge, sewer, water. Parks never had it. And we always had this battle with the what is the name of the organization? Home Builders. Home Builders. Jim, again, feisty, another feisty commissioner, Italian, very passionate. We're going to go get him. So the first time system development charge was established, which we'll talk about it a little bit later, and even today, it's paying for a lot of capital improvement. It has to be in concert with development, areas that are being developed, because it's providing services to new development. But it was a massive, massive infusion of money. And the other thing that Jim did that was very important, we started a plan for Vision 2020. And we had requested funding. And Vera wanted to build things. She didn't want to plan anymore. And so we cut Jim loose with Vera. And, they had, butted heads and stuff like that, but he succeeded. And we got the funding to do the 2-year plan, which was citizens-driven. And I think, honestly, aside from 1903 plan, Olmsted plan, that is the most significant blueprint for growth of a system that Mike is trying to also accomplish. So that was under Jim's leadership. And then when I worked with Dan Salzman, Dan was all about kids, all about disadvantaged people too. So for him, having programs, particularly for teenagers who, one day he came over and he said, I took a ride with the police last night and I saw all these teenagers hanging around the corners. What can we do about it? I said, if you come up with money, we can develop programs. And that's how we started this, our team program that has lasted for a long time. So his whole passion was about people, connection, kids, and especially abused children or people with low income. So our program, he always secured funding for that. And I think then it was Nick Fish. Unfortunately, we didn't have that much time with Nick. Nick was still learning the ropes with the city. And of all of the commissioners, I think Nick had the best ability to really tell us that we need to market ourselves better. And we did that, that he always was after making sure that everything that we do were visible, and that we needed to toot our horns a little bit louder. So that was very beneficial.
It's quite a rundown. Now I'm going to resist the urge to put Mike on the spot and talk about the two commissioners he's worked under.
Thank you, Randy. Appreciate that very much. They're both wonderful. I'm taking the Paul Kaiser approach of.
I am going to skip ahead. I may get lost here, but I wanted to talk for Mike to talk a little bit about the current tugs and pulls on the system. Yeah. Besides maintenance, we know about maintenance, and we know that we've got a bond out there. But really, what are the other forces acting on it now?
Well, there's a slide coming up on. I think one of the key pieces is equity and diversity. The 2020 vision plan that Zari talked about and really is our blueprint projected some population growth. It looked to the year 2020 and looking from the year 2000 and said, hey, what would Portland's population be? And then let's plan a system that can serve that population base. So, it's really, really solid that way. Well, it presented a population, you can see what the population was in 2001 of 529,000. What's interesting is we had virtually, by last year, had already exceeded the population projection of the 2020 vision plan. We were at, last year, 97%. So we're a little over 100% in terms of our city's population, and it's the year 2014 instead of the year 2020. But it's not just the numbers that I think are important. It's the fact that our community is changing. Between 2000 and 2008, overall population in the city of Portland grew by 5.4%. But the non-white population grew by 41%. I mean, just think about that. Our community is changing. We're not the only community that's that way. As you know, Portland is one of the most highest percentage of Caucasian residents of any major metropolitan area in the country. And that is changing, and it's going to change at a fairly rapid rate. So the thing that we know about some of these gaps in our system, the areas where we don't have parks, they happen to be in the areas of the greatest ethnic diversity and the lowest incomes. And so it makes it incumbent upon those of us who've been a part of Portland for a long time, that we're vested, we live in neighborhoods that have a good supply of parks, to realize that all Portlanders deserve that. And as our community is changing, we're going to have to all collectively step up and say that we want to provide parks for everyone. Not only the demographics are changing, but the uses of those parks are changing. And they're changing not just in Portland, they're changing all over the country. At Alberta Park in Northeast Portland, we converted a tennis court to bike polo. And you know about bike polo if you've watched Portlandia, right? There's about 2.5 seconds of bike polo on the trailer at the front end of Portlandia. Watch it, look for it if you missed it. I was at a public meeting on Parks budget a few months ago, and there was this group of people, young men, pretty heavily tatted up, and not the kind of people you usually see at a budget conversation. So I was immediately drawn to them. Hey guys, how you doing? I'm Mike, tell me. And it turns out they were all 8 guys. They were all in their 20s. They had all moved to Portland. Why? Because, well, you know, right? You know what? Well, this is where bike polo happens. I said, thank you for, as the parks director, I feel like I should have known that. But I didn't. And then they went on to tell me why they needed a stadium with bleachers, and they were going to have this tournament, and it's us against Seattle, but it's so encouraging when a younger generation says, hey, we got some ideas here. We want to plug in. And so whether it's foot golf or frisbee golf or excuse me, disc golf, sorry, apologize for that inadvertent advertisement. And the bike polo and anything related to cycling, including BMX and mountain biking and extreme mountain biking, that's a big change. So the organized sports, athletics teams, they're booming. And they're adding things like, obviously, kickball and other games as well. But it's these sort of individual sports that are really changing parks quite a bit. Sustainable management practices. We are the only park system in the United States that is salmon safe certified. That means all of our practices have been looked at by a third party and said that whether it's tending roses or how we deal with invasive species, we're doing it in a way that is protecting salmon. I believe that we are on the cutting edge. Portland always has been, but there's more to learn from other people like Battery Park City in New York and others. And so we're making some big improvements. I want to point out this one, the right-hand side of the slide there, talks about Riverview Natural Area. That's an incredibly valuable piece of property that the city purchased using funds from parks and Metro and environmental services to protect the healthy watersheds of this area and the Willamette. You can't see it probably very clearly, but the left hand of the 2 slides shows a picture of a view when we got the property. And it's absolutely covered in ivy and other invasive species, ivy up the trees, and in about 15 months, what you see on the right-hand side happened. All the invasive species were gone. all the native species that were in the seed bed of the forest floor germinated and didn't have ivy to fight their way through. And we learned some things at a big scale, 150 acres, where we were able to almost completely eradicate invasive species that I want to take as a lesson to think about bigger landscapes like Forest Park. And then Zari has led this bureau with an eye towards excellence in design. And that is part of our DNA as well, is when we do parks, we do them in a way that they will survive the test of time. They'll be flexible, but they'll be beautiful places. And this idea of what is beauty is I think something that Portland is uniquely qualified to do, is to create a new aesthetic. We said that form follows function, but when it comes to parks and green spaces, I believe that function, particularly environmental, ecological function of space, can be a partner with form, and you can have beauty. Tanner Springs Park on the right, that is a real heron. I think that's probably a Mike Hauk picture. He sends me a picture of an osprey or a heron at Tanner Springs almost on a weekly basis. A completely man-made but beautiful place that functions ecologically. And I think that's a big move in our community that can set standards for other parks all around the world.
So I want to circle back to the idea of this dedicated fund. What would it, first off, Mike, how much do you need?
Oh, excellent. We're going to collect checks at the...
You've got, by various tallies, $300 to $400 million in deferred maintenance.
Yeah, so repair and replacement of things that are broken. It's not just deferred maintenance, but is right around 370 million. But then also, if you were to add in sort of building out a park system so that everybody had a park within a half a mile, that's also another 400 million or so. So it's in the $700 or $800 million. And as Zari mentioned, our asset base right now is worth about $1 billion if you were to replace it. So you throw all that together, you realize our system at full build out, it's about a $2 billion system.
So you're ready to roll up your sleeves. What does it look like? What would be the tool?
Well,
what would be the mechanism?
you have to recognize that there are different kind of fundings for different purposes. I talked about system development charge to allow, as the growth happens, so there is some money for growth of that area. The Gateway Park or Beach Park in Outer East area, they're using system development because a lot of development happened there and the money was collected and now it's time to spend it in that area. So what is really lacking is stable source of funding, predictable source of funding for day-to-day operation and for planning and executing the plans for the future. Usually, having a dedicated source of fund, for instance, in Tualatin Hills Parks and Recreation or in Vancouver, it doesn't necessarily mean that you will not go for a bond measure periodically to do massive capital improvement or do levy. But it gives you money, just like library. Library used to be part of the Multnomah County General Fund. And they first really improved and built their infrastructure, improved it. But then operationally, they had to close hours and they had all of these assets. And finally, dedicated group of people and supporters worked for 10 years to set the stage for the final passage of dedicated funding this last year. And I think that we could do the same thing. It's not going to happen politically. It's hard. because that means that given our tax limitations, that there would be a lot of political fights between city, county, and all the others. It has to come from citizens. It has to come from grassroots. And I think the time is right because Mike can tell you that in the past 8 years, every time the citizens of Portland have been polled about services they receive from the city, park services get the highest marks or close to highest mark after Fire Bureau.
No, this year we beat fire for the first time in history.
Great.
And
Right.
yeah, and we love the Fire Bureau.
Right,
We
right,
love our
right.
brothers and sisters over there, but
So,
parks is number one.
So, the love is there. The love is there. And in the past 15, 20 years, people have shown that they are willing to invest in their park system when they are asked and when they're proven that it's needed. And we can prove to them, and it's not very hard, and we can do it.
So before the replacement bond came onto the radar screen, I know that there'd been some internal polling on a new bond, and I've never quite understood why I hadn't already thought of the replacement bond and that. Maybe you can explain that for the wonks in the audience who follow these things, because it was, a year ago, there was polling for Parks bond. I was like, can't do it.
Right. Well, I think that it was about the size of the lift. Mm-hmm. And so the polling a year ago, of course, the economy, a year ago was a little bit different than it's been the past 12 months. But the poll was really looking at a bond in the range of somewhere around $200 million. And that would have meant a tax increase. And so that didn't poll very well. So always in the back of our mind, there was always this sort of, well, that may just be too heavy a lift. What if we just kept the tax rate the same? And that's what led to the replacement bond. So, but I think one of the questions we're getting the most often is, how come you're only going after 68 million? That's not, if you have $360 million of need, why are you only going, well, because it would pass, we think, maybe. So that's the reality of what we think the public has told us their tolerance is.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And when you say a grassroots movement, do you feel that there has to be a sort of lead-in to basically creating a dedicated fund? A little bit like what the arts tax, which is continually railed against in the editorial pages of the
There will always be
Oregonian.
consequences, but once you do it, once you have a little bit of money, and if you then, I think this is very critical. When you get the money, you have to do the best to deliver the promises that you made. Yeah. That's why the 94 parks bond was so successful, and we could, pass other levies and bonds. So, and that's the challenge that the arts tax had, and they start. But once they do that, once they deliver what they promise to voters, the voters are going to, because they see the benefits, and they will accept it. So the grassroots means civic leaders, friends of parks, citizens from neighborhoods, neighborhood association, everybody. Just think about it. Every good thing that has happened with park system in the history of its existence, it's been through that promotion and grassroots involvement and civic leaderships from Eliot, what's his name? Thomas Lamb Eliot, Hawkins, and Aaron Lewis to Committee of 50, who they formed in 1945 and created Forest Park. These were all civic leaders, citizens, friends groups. In fact, they formed the oldest friends group. We didn't even talk about friends group. The city Parks Bureau has over 70, 80 friends group. Without them, that's civic leadership. Without them, this system could not survive. So that's what I mean.
It's 7 o'clock, and I want to make sure that we get to a few audience questions, if anybody has any. Anybody want to raise their hand? Yes.
Hi.
Shout it out.
Brian Birch. I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about the difference function dedicating toward the use mode versus parks where one goes to escape uses and places and just commune in the natural setting or the unaffected setting?
It's a topic we've just discussed and talked about discussing. It's actually in the slide deck, but we'll just improvise.
Do you want me to start?
No, go ahead.
Okay. You know, when I became director, a whole series of directors before me, their focus was really on recreation. And recreation was very, very important. But given again, I don't want to beat the dead horse here, given our inadequate funding, it meant that parks, on the park side, on the green side, always was suffering. And when I became director, given my profession and given my passion, I tried to sort of even up change the tilt a little bit and pay more attention to parks as places for respite, as places that you don't just go to recreate, you just go and observe the beauty, to have a quiet time. That's why it was so important for me as I work in these new development areas and try to fight to set aside land for parks, that they're large enough that if you want to have your basketball or your playgrounds, it's large enough that it would be quiet area or areas for beauty, for gardens, so people can sit. So that became really from the beginning, that was very, very important. And I tried, even in small parks, to create that kind of variety. And we had a lot of talented designers who helped us achieve that, to sort of have a good balance and integration of recreation and this solitude, which is so important for mental refreshment, basically.
Yeah, and I would also add that, a big part of our system is our natural areas. So it's not the developed parks in the way that you might think traditionally of a park, but the fact that the vast majority of our 11,000 acres are natural areas that have maybe trails, maybe a kiosk, maybe a sign or two to direct you, but are filled with places for solitude, for nature study, for just quiet and reflection. But I don't think that our natural areas are the only places for those things. As a matter of fact, when we started working on the design of Tanner Springs Park, we were given one word from the neighborhood association: contemplative. We live in the Pearl District. It's busy at Jameson Square. We want a place that's contemplative. And so that turned out to be a kind of a weird sort of place of nature and obviously built environment. But I think I see in our system, it's a spectrum. It's not either natural area or developed park. It's actually, it's a spectrum that starts with a most primal protected area that maybe does not even have public access, all the way over to the other side, Delta Park, where you've got 400, 500 people playing in a soccer tournament. And there's a spectrum across all of that. And one of the things that kind of inspires me is to think about, how do you over here have natural function, ecological function in an area that you might think, well, we can't do that, that's a sports park. Ah, really? Well, maybe we should think about that a little bit differently. So I think there's a continuum rather than just sort of a binary, oh, it's a natural area or it's a developed park.
Yeah, it sort of acts out on both the micro and the macro scale, and the work we've been doing with the Halpern fountains. Mm-hmm. Of course, Lovejoy at one time was a town swimming hole. Now it's surrounded by buildings and really cut off. But everybody, time and time and again, those who don't appreciate its design consider it a failure because it's not used. Mm-hmm. You get folks like Project for Public Places, who say the design is a failure because there's nobody there, where it's a really lovely place. It's like going by a mountain stream. At the macro scale, of course, is Forest Park.
Right.
And are you staying the course with policies at Forest Park, or do you feel like that there needs to be better integration of things like mountain biking there?
Well, I think actually when I sort of look to the future and think of what I would like to get accomplished, we have just from hearing people's opinions about Forest Park and recognizing that it is the gem of our system, but it probably hasn't had the investment in resources and time and energy that it's really needed. We have an idea of a thing we're calling Renew Forest Park. And it's a three-pronged approach, and it's probably a 10 to 20-year plan that would do several things. One part is restore Forest Park. So that's taking the lessons that we talked about at Riverview Natural Area with native species removal and applying that at a larger scale. How many people in the audience have been in Forest Park pulling ivy? Can I see your hands? Okay, at least a third of the audience has pulled ivy. It's a wonderful experience, isn't it? And don't at the end of the day, you say to yourself, gosh, I got a lot done. Wasn't that good? No, everybody should do it. If you haven't done it, you should do it because it's part of our civic.
It's like the beach cleanup.
Yeah, it's kind of like the beach cleanup. Go pull ivy. It'll make you feel better. But I would much rather have everyone here pulling ivy once we've got it down to a baseline of near removal, and now we're trying to keep it out. And because you'd feel better about, oh, there's a sprig of ivy, I got to go grab that one, rather than, oh my gosh, look at the size of that slope. So Renew Forest Park has Restore Forest Park, Rebuild Forest Park. For those of you who know or may not know, we've got trails that are closed, bridges that are out, slides that have happened, that have closed things, and going back to the resources, don't have the resources to fix them. And finally, Reconnect Forest Park. One of the things that happened under Zari's leadership is the acquisition of a piece of property at St. Helens Road and Yon Avenue, where Highway 30 makes a big turn. We own some property there that one of the things I continually hear about Forest Park is it doesn't have a face. It doesn't have, where do I go? How do I get in? It's kind of complicated if you're not from the neighborhood. We could build a stewardship center with the Forest Park Conservancy as our key partner and have a place where people could learn about this phenomenal 5,500 acre resource that actually, just the other day, I was thinking is kind of the tip of a spear of a green space that reaches all the way to the Oregon coast. And we are the stewards of the tip, and we must do a better job. So I'm hopeful that in my tenure as director, one of the things that we could do as a community is rise up and make a major investment in the health of Forest Park.
Other questions? Yeah.
Hang on, I'm going to give you a microphone here.
Thank you. Yeah, I live in the Hollywood district, and I have a question about the development fees. What kind of development actually pays those types of development fees, and how long do they build up? How do they get allocated? You know, we're a small neighborhood, but we have a fair amount of development where they tear down little houses and put up apartment buildings. Right. So does that generate development fees that could ultimately result in park funds for our neighborhood?
Yes. So that's a great question. So here's the way system development charges work. All development, whether it's commercial or residential, pays a parks system development charge. It's a very different rate, much lower for commercial properties. The theory and the rationale is that a commercial project, let's say it's a retail or office space, doesn't generate as much demand for parks as a residential development does. Residential developments pay a system development charge based on the number of units that they have.
And you pay exactly the same amount whether your unit's 500 square feet or 5,000 square feet.
And that's currently, and and there's a citizen committee right now looking at that issue to see if that's
Speaking as one who paid $15,000.
Yeah.
Can I ask a quick follow-up?
Yeah, sure.
So does that include redevelopment of existing properties
Yeah.
that are major remodels, or is it only for new construction?
If it's currently zoned and occupied as a retail space, then that's a tenant improvement and it wouldn't trigger system development charges. But if you had a warehouse that was converted to loft housing units, then it would pay residential. But then the allocation question, which is your point, the way that the methodology works, and I apologize, it's a little bit wonky. There's two zones in the city: Central City and everything else. Okay, believe it or not, everything else in the past 10 years has generated about 2/3 of the system development charges. The Central City, by the way, includes South Waterfront, the Pearl District, most of those areas where downtown core, you think, gosh, there's so much development there. Yes, there's a lot of development there, but it's generated only about 1/3 of the total pool. The methodology is the intent is to expend those resources that come in at roughly the same proportion. So 1/3 of the money is generated downtown, so 1/3 of the money gets invested downtown. Now, within those two zones, though, it doesn't say that if you live in Hollywood and you generate, a development generates $100,000 or $200,000, it doesn't say that $100,000 or $200,000 is spent in Hollywood. That gets into the selection process. The selection process that Commissioner Fritz is using is to A, look at where are the most parks deficient areas, and then B, work through the neighborhood associations and the neighborhood coalitions to get their feedback on the highest priorities for those system development charges, funds for those, where to allocate those. That's how Beach Park, Gateway Park, Thomas Cully Park, Whitaker Ponds, all in areas in outer northeast or outer east, we've announced expenditures of SDC funds. So I could go in a lot more detail, but that's in general how it works.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. Other questions?
So I have a question. I was very active in another neighborhood association.
If you could use the microphone. And remember, it's a question.
So I was active in the Northwest Neighborhood Association, and as you know, Conway is doing a big development, and they were talking about the systems development fees. And Commissioner Fritz came out and said that we couldn't have another park in that neighborhood because of what you just explained, that there was supposedly too many parks in that neighborhood and there was other needs. But I was wondering, with your shortfall of funds, have you considered a more active involvement with private versus public funding, where, for instance, if we could have convinced Conway, which they were actually more than welcome to step up, and get the developers who are building those buildings to specifically donate money for a park that they would in turn benefit from because their buildings would be on that piece of property, that they in turn would pay like an HOA fee to maintain that park and get PP&R out of it. That's what we kept asking, is why do we have to have PP&R then involved at all if we could get private money to do it on their own?
Well, I'll give you a couple examples. One, just I think public-private partnerships is first maybe a theme. We have, as Zari said, about 100 private-public partnerships. Pioneer Courthouse Square, for example, is a public-private partnership. There's a nonprofit that operates Pioneer Courthouse Square in partnership with, it's a City of Portland park, but it's operated by a board that generates revenue through events and then reinvests. So we have a long tradition of that. Randy mentioned the Halpern Landscape Conservancy, which is looking at the Halpern blocks. They're looking at ways of raising funds to partner with Portland Parks. And then specifically about Conway, we have an MOU with Conway. And in that process, they proposed actually the exact similar thing to what you just described. They wanted a plaza. And when we look at the neighborhood, and we talked to neighbors, what we heard is, we want an open space, we want a park. But the developer and the developer team really felt, and many members of the neighborhood thought a plaza would really be a good thing to have. And so what Conway did is said, okay, we're gonna keep this property to ourselves, and we're gonna develop a plaza on that. And we said, fine, that absolutely, not a problem. And so as far as I know, they're still proceeding with that. So we'd be happy to partner with Conway on that, or even a park adjacent. And I think that process is still going. It's not over with. Yeah. Yeah. No.
I'm going to go back to a little bit of our format so we can kind of complete some thoughts that we wanted to communicate to you. And I wanted to go back to Zari and sort of retrospectively have her sort of look at her career in Portland Parks and really tell us what are you sort of proudest of and which ones got away. Maybe which ones got away first.
Yeah. Did you put those slides?
I did, yeah, and I'm not sure where they're at, so.
Okay, just keep moving. No, you have to keep going.
Okay.
Yeah.
There's one that got away.
I guess, that was the last slide.
Yeah.
Many of you probably know that I am native Iranian. I was born and raised in the northern part of Iran by the Caspian Sea. And I had sent a couple of slides to Randy, but I think they're not here, to show you the environment where I was raised, because I think that environment has greatly influenced my decision making. I mean, my passion for parks, open spaces, natural areas, and the decisions that I've made throughout my career. The Caspian Sea, as you can see in the top left, is on the border of former Soviet Union, now a lot of stans, and Iran, and just like here, the distance between Caspian Sea and the range of mountains that are called Alborz Mountain that you see here in the background, the distance between the sea and this range of mountains is about 10 miles, 10, 15 miles, and then flat. It had this beauty and grandeur, and at the time when I left, the influence, the man's influence was very, very sensitive, gentle, very respectful of nature. And for me, working with parks, one of my first jobs was working on Powell Butte project, and I'm very proud of that. It was a neglected 640 acres belonging to Water Bureau that was abused, and because it was costing them money, we were able to convince them to let us manage it and develop a plan. And because of that beauty that I experienced, I wanted to make sure all of our parks had beauty as well. And that's where that aesthetic tradition that I try to create, trying to bring the most talented designers, local and national and international, to help us. I wanted every single park to be unique and respectful of the context and the environment that it was being built at. And to me, nature was very important. And one of the things that I'm most proud of, what you asked, is trying to give people and the part of the organization that worked on natural area, give it this status, long sort of neglected status that it deserved by creating city nature. And when you deal with human beings and the needs of the human beings and activities of kids, you always want to help them. And it is very, very natural to say, when you have limited funding, say, okay, I'm going to help the kids, the elderly, and everything, and all the others just get crumbs. And they were getting crumbs. And to me, it was important to really shift that culture and that attitude. And I think that's a legacy that I'm proud of. And then the other one is access to river, connectivity, the trails. When Springwater Trail was built, my whole thought was, wouldn't it be great to bike from downtown Portland all the way to Mount Hood? So creation on East Bank Esplanade, as torturous as that was the most rewarding experience that I've had. And then obviously trying to make sure that places like South Waterfront, Pearl, these brownfields, that new development were happening there, they had adequate space for parks. And then setting the bar high. I want to just give one anecdotal information. Very early in my career, I was redeveloping a park, I don't want to mention which park, in inner southeast neighborhood. And I was working with Bob Morassi, which was a great designer. And we wanted to put a playground. And I said to Bob, you know, all of these jungle gyms and all of this stuff, you know, we're just tired of that. Could we do something totally different? And he said, you want to do that? Absolutely. So he came up with this extremely abstract but beautiful, simple design with metal, which was for toddler areas. I was thrilled with it. I was a lowly planner then. So I went to the neighborhood association with that. Both of us tried to describe this. If you remember Bob Morassi, those of you who remember, he was very quiet, so I had to do most of the talking. And I did my best. But the neighborhood really was not ready for something like that. They just wanted their traditional stuff. So I had to wait for the right place and right moment to do the right thing. And the Pearl, Jameson Square, you know, I really worked very hard to convince Homer Williams that if you let us do this first one really well, you would never regret it. And Homer got really converted after Jameson Square. And that set the bar, and lo and behold, people who didn't want to be another Pearl, they wanted another Jameson Square. They want another Tanner Spring. They don't want the development, but they want those parks. Because now, you know, the entire city. So you have to do it. I learned through that process that you can't be premature. You have to do it the right place when people are ready and once they see it. And the same situation was with Southwest Community Center. That was the first community center we built in 50, 60 years. And we built that, and at the same time we were working in outer Southeast. We had this beautiful design. People wanted conventional community center. And this is where Charlie Hales came and said, no, we're not doing that. They said, well, our neighborhood is, you know, we have these low rises, we don't want anything like that. And Charlie said, I promise you, you're going to be very proud of it. And we came up with that design, and they are all proud of it. So there are places that you have to just be ready and take advantage of, and then when it's successful, people like it.
Let's beam ahead 20 years and look back at Mike Abbate's tenure in Portland Parks. What will it look like?
Well, it will be even more beautiful than it is today. There will be no gaps in our system. There will be places for people. We will have accommodated incredible growth in the Portland metropolitan area, and we will have been really creative in how we create public space. We will run out of real estate on which to develop parks. And so our culture of participating and cooperating and collaborating with whether it's a private developer or a nonprofit to think about new open spaces. San Francisco has a program, POPOS, publicly open, privately owned public space. We'll have to think about some of those things to make sure that our recreation needs and our needs for solitude and quiet are incorporated. We have an incredible infrastructure. And when I say infrastructure, I mean Mike Hauk is here in the audience. We have, as a community, said, we don't have to choose between being in the city or being in nature. We want to have both, and we want to have both everywhere. And I can see that. I would love for that to be part of the legacy, where we see that realized at even a higher level than it is now. I hope that we are a community that is even more accepting and embracing of people that are different than us. As our culture changes, I hope that makes us stronger as a community. I hope that our designs of parks reflect the changing culture and changing demographics, so that everybody can walk into a community center and feels welcome and feels that there's going to be something for them. I think one of the big goals I have is that we do something about our kids. Our kids are tied to electronic devices. They're spending 8 to 9 to 10 hours a day, and they spend about 2 minutes a day outside in free play. That's got to change. And we have a role in that. Portland Parks and Recreation can get kids outside, physically active, and engaged in the community. Those three things go together. We need the next generation of citizens. We need those bike polo players. Who is the next generation of bike polo folks that come in and say, hey, we want this in our park. This is to old guys like me, and help us realize that we're not just serving the folks in this room, we're serving 2 or 3 generations down the road. So those are some things I'm hoping for.
Okay, that's a great general vision. Now you both have to answer a specific. Real quick, we've got like 2 minutes.
Okay.
Zari,
Yes.
what should Ross Island look like in 20 years?
Ross Island needs to be wetland, and all of the stuff that is there should leave, but all those industrial structural elements should remain, and I can just envision that nature will take over, and there's that beauty of
But should there be a beach?
No.
Mike?
Well, there was a plan for Ross Island that I think we should bring out that had, all kinds of development. I think an entire amusement park, and we could build a bridge over to it.
That was the Olmstedian vision.
With a giant swimming pool. I hope that Ross Island is as healthy and restored, but that we find a way to incorporate people, because the river is the lifeblood of the city. And the more that we can get people experiencing the river and the natural beauty of the island and the herons when it's appropriate and all of that, the more they will value nature in the city. So I would not want to put a fence around it and keep people out. I would want to be good stewards that allows people to visit and appreciates it. Maybe we have a docent, a naturalist that is there that helps people recognize and experience that fantastic place.
Please join us next Thursday for some visions of some future parks. And
Can I have a closing word?
oh yes.
Okay.
It has to be really quick though, because Stephanie will get mad at me.
Okay. So I want to read to you a quote from Paul Kaiser about the qualifications of being a park director. This doesn't apply to Zari, but it applies to me. And it's just irresistible. 1951, he says, I submit that anybody with brains employed in public affairs would be an oddity. Now, this was a male-dominated culture, 1951, so I apologize for what I'm about to say. I expect if a man has brains and any common sense, he will employ them in something more remunerative. It makes money. Something more money-making than in the administration of public recreation. That does not say by any manner of means that compensations or rewards of merit will not be coming to the man in park and recreation service who has the disposition and cottons to do the job. Lots of people would enjoy holding your position, and plenty of them could fill it. I should say that sheer brains is not a prime requisite, but what Solomon referred to as understanding, together with initiative, vigilance, vision, humor, are all highly essential qualities in an administrator who will leave his impress on the life of his community. I know I can live up to the requirement for the lack of brain power, and I trust Portlanders will find me sufficient in the areas of energy and vision and things that Kaiser talks about. So, thank you.
Zari Santner and Mike Abbate, thanks so much.
Thank you.